Um, Welcome back for our second week of classes. I am going to walk you through our assignment that's due on Friday, as well as the new Google form that I've made for our first voting of the semester, and then we'll do our lecture. Here's our course pre-quiz. This is your first homework. It's very short. I just need your name, your email, and then there's a couple of questions. Very basic. There's a link to a quiz if you haven't taken one. Otherwise, you can just describe. This is due on Friday, September 6th at midnight my time. So, like 4 a.m. your time or 3 a.m. or whatever. 11:59 is basically midnight. 3:59 is basically 4 a.m. Yeah. A couple of you have turned it in. There's also, if you go to the assignments on Brightspace, there is a Dropbox here. If you go to the assignment, that's not going to bring up what I want. You can fill out the Google form, but I've also uploaded a PDF and a Microsoft Doc. You can just fill those out and then put them into the Dropbox, whichever works for you, the Google form or a Dropbox. And then the second thing we have is this Google form, which is only a Google form, unfortunately. And your second assignment, the first is the Federalist Papers. You have to read 10 and 51, then answer some questions. The second one is just watching a movie and then answering questions based on the movie, a couple of them. Actually, they're all in the movie chronological, and then there's one overall question at the end. So we need to get ahead of ourselves, and I would like you to pick the movie you get to watch. I give you a couple of options. If there's another movie that you guys think would be good, just let me know, and I can add it to this. I'm looking primarily for movies that have to do with a unit of the class. So the media or judicial system, Congress, and it preferably would be academic, educational. Um, Now, these movies are good, I will say. These are very dramatized. These are real actors, like it's a movie. It's entertainment, but you will learn something from them. So you have some options here. You just pick. It's a general polling. Um, you can do your own research on any of these if you'd like. I'll give you a little bit of background. So, All the President's Men is the first of the four, and it is the oldest movie. I believe it came out maybe in the 80s. Um, but it's basically how the two journalists uncovered the Watergate scandal, which, if you don't know, is when President Nixon got in trouble for raiding the Democratic National Committee office, got caught, and he ended up resigning from it. So this is just how the journalists uncovered that. And then the second one is Spotlight. This is the most popular movie. I think I've had every other class vote on this movie. This one came out in 2015. Mark Ruffalo is in this. He plays the Hulk, if you don't know who he is. Um, the thing about this movie, though, is that it can definitely be a little triggering. Um, it is about the Catholic priest scandal in the 70s, primarily this is all over the country. It's all over the world actually, but it was based in Boston, and the movie is based in Boston. Um, and it was a story of how the journalists uncovered the scandal of Catholic priests abusing children. So, if you're Catholic, this might not be a great movie for you. I think it is very educational. I think it's based on that, and it is how they uncover that, but most of the story is about media and gatekeeping, um, and it's not really about the scandal. They use that as a background to show how media works, um, but it is a little bit more triggering. The third one is Trial of the Chicago Seven, which is how the judicial system, it's about the judicial system, and there was a bunch of protests around the Democratic National Convention in 1969. Um, 7 people basically got charged, and this is a movie about their way through the judicial system, how they went through court, how they were charged, how they were convicted or not convicted, how the jury works, all that kind of stuff. This movie came out in 2020, so I think this is the newest one. Um, and then the last one is The Post, which is a media story about how news media uncovered the Pentagon Papers, which talk about how we were losing the war and we just kept going back and fighting it. Um, Spanning, I think, 7 presidents, maybe 5. Um, and throughout the whole time, like every president would send ambassadors and researchers and scientists and military personnel to evaluate the situation. They would all come back and say, yeah, we're losing, we should pull out. None of the presidents ever pulled out because the US had never lost a war. And it was against like our reputation to pull out, to lose the war. Um, it's also about the first woman to leading a national paper, the Washington Post. This movie came out in 2017 and probably has like the most stars you would think of. Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep, and Sarah Paulson are like the big names. All these movies are available on streaming. There are obviously like paid rented versions of all of them elsewhere, but you can get All the President's Men on YouTube Movies for free. You can get it Spotlight on HBO Max and Hulu, I believe. It's also on Amazon Prime. Trial of the Chicago 7 is only on Netflix, and then The Post is on Amazon Prime. Um, so yeah, if you could fill this out. I'm not gonna set like a due date for it, but I'm probably gonna pick the movie in a couple of weeks. So just try to fill it out before then. It's super quick. It will take you 30 seconds. I'm not even requiring like your email or your name or anything. You just have to vote. So if you could just do that when you get a second, and then I'll let you know which movie we pick. I think if you will be triggered by Spotlight, that should impact whether or not you're choosing it. However, in general, like if the whole class votes on Spotlight and for some reason you are very uncomfortable with that, come talk to me. We can talk about it. We can get a different movie or you can do a different assignment. Like we can adjust. And then finally, if we pick a movie and for some reason you do not have access to like that streaming service, we can work that out too. Don't worry about it. Just email me. So just pick the movie that you're most interested in, and then whatever ends up being chosen, if you have issues with, we can deal with that independently. After I record and upload the lecture, I will create a little announcement with obviously the lecture like I did for this one, and then with links to both of these. So this will be here in the announcements, and then you can watch this for the explanation. Again, this is due Friday, your pre-quiz homework 1. This doesn't have like a due date, but I'm gonna pick in a couple of weeks. So just try to do it before then. Okay. I think that's it for like housekeeping stuff. So now I will just do our second lecture, which is the history lecture. We're going to talk about the American history, the Articles of Confederation, the US Constitution, the role of citizens, and then ideological debates. Obviously, a lot of this should be review for you, like you should have a base understanding of these things. But just in case you don't, that's what this is. It's also what the course pre-quiz is. So why America? People came to America in attempts to escape poverty, famine, and religious persecution. Local governments were established due to the distance between America and the motherland, aka England, right? So when people immigrated to America, we were still under the rule of the King of England. We were still like being ruled by the monarchy in England, but obviously that's like an entire ocean away, and there had to be some idea of how to structure day-to-day life, how to structure government, like how things are being collected and ruled on. And so we did have local governments. There were no like national governments. We didn't have United States of America, we didn't have senators and we didn't have a president. But we did have little local governments. Primarily, it was like the leader of the town. And most times that would be the religious leader of the town. And there was the town crier, usually, who would go around giving news. It was like the modern day media. Um, and then community town squares, people could vote on some things, couldn't vote on other things. It really depended on the local government. And local government was set up, when I say local, I mean very, very local. Like it was the little town. You think of rural America, it was like that in the 1700s. So maybe like any number of people, but in their little area, right? Like we didn't have, even though we had colonies, those colonies were not an entire government. It was very, very local. It was very small. And the restrictions were very like vague. Everything was less clear cut. Actually, until the revolution, women could vote if they owned property and there were no males in the household. But you had to own land or otherwise be wealthy and practice religious specifications, and also obviously enslaved peoples could not vote. So that's how the government worked, was you had to have some level of privilege. And if you were a woman, you could vote if you had this privilege. Um, we had a toxic relationship with England. So the colonies acted as a trading partner for England in exchange for military protection. We were still under England's control. We were also still under England's military. And so if for some reason there was a conflict with maybe other colonists, maybe the Spanish or the French colonists, or the Native Americans, or anyone up in Canada who at the time, I believe, were French. Any conflict, it was up to England and England's military to send to America to protect us. Unfortunately, this wasn't happening as often as it should have, so it did end up being to the colonists a lot of times to protect themselves. But if there was a big conflict, like the French and Indian War, England would send their military. Um, any goods produced in America by the colonies, specifically by the colonies, were the property of England and were used by England to trade, not only within our local communities where they would barter and trade for services and goods, but also sent back to England, and England would sell them or use them or trade them there. And then we obviously have the French and Indian War, in which England was acting as a protector of the colonies from both France and Spain. Um, Again, we were in conflict with both. France was obviously like the Canadian northern colonies, and then the Spanish colonies were more southern. You can think of Florida in that way. However, the war was very costly for England, and King George was taxing the colonies to pay for their own defense. So now at this time, not only is everything we're growing and creating and sending to England all of our resources to be sold or traded, we're also now paying for our own defense. So we're basically running on our own, but just being told what to do by the King of England. So obviously we had the revolution, and the main reasons for this come from this conflict. So England wanted the colonists to pay for the war. They wanted the colonists to keep sending resources. They wanted the colonists to keep identifying as England and being under the control of England. And England wanted to control the colonies, right? They wanted the laws and the religious specifications. And they wanted to be able to send people and prisoners to America, and they would still be English. Obviously, the colonists didn't want any of these things. The colonists were like, hey, this is really unfair. Like, you're taxing us for all these things that you promised us you would take care of in exchange for us sending you all of our resources. We also started to get this idea of popular sovereignty coming to the head of you have to consent to be ruled by your government. And at this time, because of this war and because of the taxes, colonists believed that England was tyrannical and they were neglecting civil liberties. Therefore, they didn't believe in the popular sovereignty of the English government. Sorry, hold on, my cat. We're not going to do this back and forth. Okay, sorry. Um, so yeah, they believed that England was tyrannical and neglecting civil liberties. They were also quartering soldiers. So whatever soldiers England was sending were being stationed in the colonists' homes. The colonists were responsible for feeding them and clothing them and taking care of them, and they weren't getting anything out of it. What happened next? None of these years will be on like your essays or your exams or anything. I just give them to you so you can see how everything happened in chronological order. So first we had the Boston Massacre. So on March 3rd, 1770, there was a protest protesting the quartering of soldiers mainly, but just the general existence of England. And British troops who were there to protect England ended up firing into the crowd of protesters, and they killed 5 of them. A couple of years later, we obviously have the Boston Tea Party, which is the most famous event of this list. On December 16th, 1773, tea that was owned by the East India Company was dumped into the Boston harbor to protest the tea tax. So when we talk about England wanting the colonists to pay for the war, it was mainly through taxes. It wasn't like the colonists had to just send $500 over to England. England wanted to raise taxes on everything, primarily sugar and tea, and then like paper products. And the idea being that this raise in taxes would pay for the war and pay for the soldiers and etc., the weapons. Um, so really, they were protesting again the general idea of England, but it was done through this specific tea tax. The East India Company, although it is called the East India Company, is a British company based in India. India was a colony of England at the time. And then the next year, we have the First Continental Congress. So in 1774, each colony sent delegates to Philadelphia to discuss the unrest and the protesting and, the general conflict that was happening, not only between England and the US, but like the French and Indian War, I believe. Yeah, actually, the French and Indian War had ended. Sorry. French and Indian War had ended, but we were still being taxed. The colonists were still being taxed. Um, so now we're 10 years after the war, still being taxed by England. Not only are we not paying for the war any longer, we're supposed to be paying back the debts of the war, but it had been 10 years. Um, and so they send all these delegates to Philadelphia to talk about it. Like, hey, what are we going to do? Um, at this first Continental Congress, the delegates sent a Declaration of American Rights and Grievances, which basically threatened to stop trade until the colonies were recognized by King George III as being separate. And then we have the Second Continental Congress 2 years later in 1776. Okay, so we sent this Declaration of Rights and Grievances to King George, and King George said, yeah, that's not happening. Sorry. You still have to pay us taxes. You still have to send us all of your things and follow British laws. So in April 1775, we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which started the Revolution. And then in 1776, Congress developed the ability to create and execute laws and established a unicameral government. So First Continental Congress goes to meet. They set up a list of things that King George is doing wrong, send it to King George, say, hey, fix this, or give us our independence, basically like recognize us as sovereign states. Again, we're still not like a country. We're not collected. We want to recognize as sovereign states. Each colony would be separated. And King George says, no, there are still British soldiers in like quartering, living in colonist houses. And they are ordered by King George basically to put an end to like this, um, what's the word? Like this conspiracy. Um, so in April 1775, there was a battle between the quartered soldiers of England and then obviously like the colonists. And that's what started the real revolution. So next year, 1776, Congress meets again. Probably not the same people. It may have been, truly, I don't know. I doubt that it was. But they go back, delegates from each colony go back and develop themselves as a Congress that can create and execute laws, and everyone gets a vote. Every delegate gets a vote. And they write up the Declaration of Independence. Again, telling King George basically, like, hey, we asked you to fix these things. You didn't fix these things. Now you started a war. We want to be completely independent. We want to be our own states. So it was written by the Second Continental Congress, and it officially declared the U.S. independent from the British Empire. The First Continental Congress did not do this. The First Continental Congress only laid out the things that colonists were unhappy with England doing. The Second Continental Congress is what gave us actual independence. It was primarily authored by Jefferson. Of course, we know this, Thomas Jefferson, and he was primarily influenced by John Locke. If you go back to our previous lecture, we talked about the idea of the social contract theory and popular sovereignty and consenting to your government. All John Locke's ideas, who heavily influenced Thomas Jefferson, who then wrote our Declaration. Again, in this declaration, we listed all of our complaints. So it said, hey, we're free from England. We want to be free from England. Here's why. Here's all the things that we're upset with. We asked you to fix. You didn't fix. It was controversial because many colonists still wanted to be part of England. They still wanted to be loyal to England. This could have been for a variety of reasons, right? This could have been because of their familial ties to England. This could have been because maybe they were recent colonists. They had just moved there. This could have been because they didn't trust other colonists, right? This is where we see the idea of rugged individualism really taking hold in this time. Like, they didn't trust each other. They would trade and they would live in the same communities, but your community in Massachusetts is very different than a community in North Carolina, and they didn't trust each other. They didn't know each other. They knew their town and they knew their connection to England, the families they had left. So a lot of colonists wanted to continue to be English. They wanted to be part of England. Of course, many colonists did not, especially the Continental Congress. So after we declared independence from England, we obviously had the war, etc., etc. And from there, we have creating like the states' governments. Again, we are not a country. This is not a national government. This was the colonies providing and creating their own states in which they wrote their own constitutions. And the Second Continental Congress encouraged them to do this. So they formed their own armies and their own navies. They argued over boundary lines and they experienced a lot of trade wars, primarily across these state lines and where the boundaries were, whether you were in Massachusetts or you were in Maryland or you were in New York or where this boundary line fell. However, they did have a lot of things in common. So they shared popular sovereignty, right? Each colony, despite maybe they wanted to stay with England, they still did identify with their community in the Americas and their colony. And so this low-level government was still consented to by the citizens, and they believed in that and they trusted in that, which is why they allowed these states to form their own constitutions and their own governments. Within that, though, they did still all share a limited government. There was very little power. These states could not do very much. It was primarily just the idea of creating these armies and navies, creating these boundary lines, and then implementing laws. But they couldn't do anything otherwise, right? Like they weren't collecting money and they didn't have a way to enforce these laws. And we'll get into that in the next slide. They also shared civil rights and liberties. So the rights of the citizens were clearly outlined in these constitutions, right? Like things citizens could do or were to be free from. Where we get the idea of like the not quartering of soldiers, like the US can't force soldiers to live in your home. And then the last thing they all shared was the separation of powers and checks and balances. So they all had their own outline of government and what that would look like, whether they had a more executive level or a more congressional level. Maybe they only had a city council and not like a governor. Maybe they only had a mayor and they didn't have a city council. Um, but either way, these levels of government they had all had their own powers and were independent of each other. The mayor was not supposed to be influenced by city council and vice versa. Um, After the states had created their own constitutions, we then get the Articles of Confederation, which is what really establishes the United States as the United States. It is the first constitution of the United States. But again, it's still not what we think of as being the United States of America. And it is not nearly as detailed as the Constitution we have now. Really, all this did was form a firm league of friendship, in quotes. Basically, just a loose alliance, saying, yeah, we're friends, right? Like we share boundaries and we share the same waters and we share the same land and rivers and forests. And it was a loose alliance. And it wasn't even a promise to help each other, it was more of we exist outside of England together. The federal government had no power. This articles gave the federal government no power, and Congress was the only like federal level of institution, and they couldn't do anything really. They also only had one vote in Congress from each state, regardless of the size. So if Massachusetts had more people, or if New York had more people, it didn't matter. Everyone got one vote. The main issues with the Articles of Confederation, the federal government could not carry out any actions. They could say, like, oh yeah, this is the law, but there was no enforcement. They couldn't do anything. And there was no executive to actually like carry out the actions. They also couldn't tax. Taxes were only happening through the states, and again, they weren't enforceable. So the federal government had no money to do anything, even if they wanted to. They also could not regulate commerce. So states would just get into their own debacles, their own conflicts over trading and boundary lines and the water lines. And the federal government couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't create laws, they couldn't enforce laws, they couldn't regulate trading by any means. And a lot of this was because states with their own constitutions and their own governments were using different forms of currency. They were using different ideas of like what this good and service is worth as opposed to what another good and service is worth. This was all um, very vague. There was no clear boundary here. There were no clear lines. There was no common understanding of what things were worth, where state lines were, and what the responsibility of the federal government was. So because of all of this conflict, we then get Shays' Rebellion, which primarily was based in Massachusetts. And so this happened in the mid 1780s, and it is Daniel Shay who was leading protests over the high taxes and bank foreclosures in Massachusetts. Ironic, considering we had just fought this war over high taxes from England. So what happened was is there were a lot of revolutionary soldiers who then became farmers or were farmers after their service, after the revolution, when we were officially independent, and they were not getting compensation for their service in the revolution. So they fought and they risked their lives to make America free, and they weren't getting paid for it. So first they tried peaceful matters, right? They tried what the colonists originally tried with England. They brought grievances and reforms to the legislature. And this is the Massachusetts legislature. Um, so they wrote out the list of grievances. They said, here's what we're upset with. Here's how you can fix it. And they sent it off. Um, they were protesting. Obviously, Massachusetts didn't do anything about it because they didn't have the funds. They didn't have any way to tax. They couldn't collect money anyway, so they couldn't pay soldiers. So Daniel Shays led the protests, right? Massachusetts asked Congress to send a militia. They went to Massachusetts state, went to our federal Congress, and said, hey, this is happening in our state. Can you please send an army to stop them? The United States government, the Articles government, our federal Congress, they couldn't do that because they didn't have money. They had no way to tax. They didn't have any right to do so. They had no way to collect it and no way to enforce it. So all of these soldiers turned farmers weren't getting paid, and no government had the means to tax or to pay them. So then, interestingly, this is just a little side note through this, the poor farmers and the wealthy elite bonded over this insurrection. This is not something we see very often in American history, is the different social classes mingling, not only that, but agreeing over things. But the poor farmers and the wealthy elite were bonding over this, and Chief Justice William Whiting actually supported the fight. He supported the protesters and the farmers. Eventually, the legislature offered flexibility with tax burdens through a bill that was passed excusing sheriffs who killed the insurgents or the protesters, and then a death penalty was enacted for those who participated. So we didn't really come to a conclusion. There was no, this is how we're going to fix it. They just said, okay, we're going to stop taxing you as much, even though the taxes already weren't enough to pay them. So they said, rather than trying to collect more taxes to pay you, we're just going to take more taxes off of what you owe us. Basically, you can pay yourself. But then they did pass a bill that was like any police officer who killed a protester was free and good because they were protesting. And if you were caught protesting, you could be killed for your act in protesting. Obviously, caused more issues. Vermont, the state of Vermont, quietly gave them refuge. And so a lot of people from Massachusetts were moving to Vermont basically to not be executed for their role in the protests. And eventually, after a while, the Massachusetts governor realized, okay, well, we gave you this tax burden, lessened your taxes, so you didn't have to pay as much. So you were paying yourself. And then you moved because we were going to kill you if you participated. So what we're going to do now is you left. Now we're not getting any taxes from you because you don't live here anymore. And you're not being charged for your crime of protesting because now you live in Vermont. And again, the rules were so different between states, and there was no way the federal government, the federal Congress, could legislate this. It was between the states. They had no role. So eventually the Massachusetts governor said, okay, well, we're losing more than we're trying to give anyway. We're just going to pardon you. And he pardoned all of the participants in the protest. Okay. Shays Rebellion happens. Everyone realizes, all right, clearly something's not working here because we have a state government that is ineffective. We have a federal government that's ineffective, and people are protesting over it and then dying over it. So what are we going to do? So they call the Constitutional Convention, which is, again, another meeting of delegates from all of states, the states that existed at the time, Rhode Island did not send a delegate. And these were actually what we think of as the framers. So when we talk about the framers or the founders, we're not talking about the First Continental Congress or the Second Continental Congress or the Congress during the Articles of Confederation. We're talking about delegates during the Constitutional Convention. And they were all wealthy, they were all educated, they were property owners. Most of them, about half of them, were lawyers. All of them had experience in government. They were all in some kind of local government in their state. And then a little less than half of them owned enslaved peoples, about 47%. Common misconception, the framers did not look like the population, right? Like the framers were not ordinary people. Ordinary people weren't wealthy, they weren't educated, they hadn't gone to school, they were not lawyers. Most Americans, colonists at the time, didn't own enslaved peoples. It was really only the wealthy people. So the framers are not representative of society. It's important to remember that it is on your exam because they were wealthy, because they were lawyers, because they owned other people. Most Americans, like our ordinary Americans, the protesters who weren't getting paid for their service, they weren't wealthy, they weren't educated, they didn't own slaves, etc. Again, John Locke comes up. He very heavily influenced this, primarily with the idea that government. So at this time, we already had an understanding of popular sovereignty and the social contract theory, but his role in this Constitution is that the government is responsible to preserve property and security. The framers believed people were self-interested to advance their own personal goals. So in that way, representative government was necessary. A strong national government was necessary, primarily through security and the economy, right? Like we needed to have security for protests and for invasions and for conflict between states and outside of the states. We also needed to have a way to do this, which is through the economy. Like we had to have taxes, they had to have money. You can't have military that you can't pay. How are you going to pay them? Money from the federal government. How does the federal government get money? They have to be able to tax. That's what the primary motivation here was. The government is preserving property and security. How do they do that? Through a national military. How do they uphold a national military with people that need paid and weapons that need bought and food that needs to be taken care of? Through taxes. So we had to have a national economy and we had to have a national military. They drew up two plans for this. The first was called the Virginia Plan. It was primarily propositioned by George Washington, James Madison, Edmund Randolph. You probably don't hear about Edmund Randolph as much as the other two, but he had a big hand in this. And it was supported by Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. And then we also had the second plan, clearly less popular, called the New Jersey Plan, propositioned by William Patterson and supported by Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. So while the Virginia Plan had more support by states and people, the New Jersey Plan was supported by regions and states that had a higher population. We see the disparity forming here. This is what they look like. I know there's a lot of text here. I'll walk you through it. So the Virginia Plan created a strong national government with a Congress, an executive, and a judicial system. The Congress was bicameral, which means there are two houses. There's a House of Representatives and then there's a Senate. Together, they make up Congress. The House would be elected directly from the people, whereas the Senate would be nominated by the state governments. So everyone in New York would vote for the House of Representatives, but the New York state government, whatever that was, be it their own Congress, or if they only had one house of Congress or they had two houses, whatever it was, the Senate would be nominated by the state government of their state and then have to be elected in by the House of Representatives, which were elected in by the people. The executive, aka the president, would be chosen by Congress. People would have no say in that. And then both are proportional to population. So a bigger state gets more representatives, a smaller state gets less representatives. This is really important. When I say bigger and smaller state, we're talking about population, not land mass. New York is bigger than New Jersey, but if more people live in New Jersey, they would get more representatives. And then we had this New Jersey plan. Separate plan. These are all separate. So the New Jersey plan basically just reinforced the Articles of Confederation. It was like the Articles of Confederation Part 2. Representation would be equal for all states, regardless of population. It didn't matter how many people lived there. Everyone would get the same number of representatives. They had a unicameral Congress, which means there was no House and Senate. There was just one Congress. And they would be elected by the state legislature that they are representing. So the New York government would elect them. There was an executive to enforce the laws, but there were multiple. So we'd have like 2 or 3 presidents. And then the key thing with the New Jersey plan, they included a Bill of Rights. We think of the first 10 amendments, the right to freedom, the right to press, all that kind of right to speech, freedom of speech, all of those things. They were included in the New Jersey plan, not in the Virginia plan. So we have what's called the Great Compromise, which is where we just combined them. The main disagreements between the 2 plans came from the lack or the increased power of central government, the lack of Bill of Rights, God wasn't mentioned in the document, and then citizenship. So the South wanted to count enslaved peoples into their population, and the North said, you can't do that because they can't vote. Why would they be included? So you're getting more representation, but for less people who are actually participating in government. The Federalists were thinking of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists that you know of are not directly tied to Virginia and New Jersey plan. They are a little bit, but not really. The Federalists were trying to support this new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists didn't want a new Constitution at all. They wanted the Articles of Confederation. They were cool with how things were. Most of the framers, even the ones that wanted the New Jersey plan, were still Federalists because we were trying to write a new Constitution. Anyone who didn't want the new Constitution would be an Anti-Federalist. The Federalists were very organized and aggressive. They wrote the Federalist Papers, and the Anti-Federalists lacked organization, but they did have popular ideas, like they didn't want a stronger national government. We had just fought a war to get rid of a monarchy. People are still like having trauma from that. So what do? We combined the 2 plans. We created a strong national government anyway, said Anti-Federalists, screw off, like we're doing our own thing, we're going to create a new constitution because the articles aren't working anymore. And they combined the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. So we had a bicameral Congress, right? We have a House and we have a Senate, but they're elected differently. So the House gets 2-year terms based on population. So they're only there for 2 years, and you get more representatives the more people that live in your state. Whereas the Senate gets longer terms, they're 6-year terms, but every state has the same amount. Every state has 2. Originally, the Senate was elected by the state legislature, but in 1913, the 17th Amendment changed that, and now the people elect both the House and the Senate. This is on your exam. This is also on your study guide. This is key. The reason the House has 2-year terms and is based on population is because it is intended both out of Congress, but also out of the entire federal government to be the most democratic. It is supposed to represent people closely. It is supposed to be the one that is most representative, the one that is most democratic, the one that is able to like. It's difficult because nowadays they don't get to do much because they only have 2 year terms, but in that time, it was they could do the same number of legislation, but they were more accountable to the people, right? We elect them every 2 years. If I don't like what you did in 1 year, I can get you out of there. Whereas in the Senate, you were there for 6 years regardless. So if I don't like what you did in the first year, you can keep screwing up for 5 years. So the House was supposed to be more democratic. The Great Compromise also included a Bill of Rights. Right, we have our 10 Amendments, and then the Three-Fifth Compromise. And the Three-Fifth Compromise stated that for each enslaved person would be counted as 3/5 of a person. So for every 5 enslaved people in the state of North Carolina, the state of North Carolina would get 3 counts towards their population. So if you have 15 enslaved peoples, that goes up your population by 3. Or, sorry, by 9. I'm not good at math. All right. So then how did we actually get this Constitution implemented? It was through the ratification and the Federalist Papers. So the Federalist Papers were written, there are, how many? 87? Yeah, 87. There's 87 Federalist Papers. I should know that. I watched Hamilton. Um, and they were written primarily by Alexander Hamilton. And it was a set of papers that were circulated and published to the original 13 states, arguing for why those states and the people, this was intended to go to the public, why we should ratify this new Constitution. And the reason that I'm having you read 10 and 51 and the reason that they're so important is because we still use them to understand the framers and the constitutional law, Supreme Court cases, and the functioning of government. So if there's a Supreme Court case about like whether or not the Constitution can be interpreted in some way or another, oftentimes our judges will look at the Federalist Papers to like discuss if that was intended to be the way that it was. And ultimately, after the Federalist Papers, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. So 10 and 51 are the ones that I'm going to want you to read. This assignment isn't due. Give me 1 second. Assignment isn't due for a while, but let me look anyway to check. Federalist Papers will be due on Wednesday, September 25th. So you have plenty of time to do them, but we are going to go over them now. And then they're already uploaded, so you can see them whenever. So Federalist 10 warned against the dangers of factions and stated that like this big country was best controlled by popular representation because it was so large. Like we needed the Constitution to control all of this area and all of this people, and we needed to have some control over them or we're going to have the Shades Rebellion keep happening over and over again. And then Federalist 51 talked about the checks and balances in the government and the importance of separation of powers. We're going to get into this more later. Checks and balances are different from separation of powers, and people often use them interchangeably, but they're very different. Checks and balances are like the veto power, whereas separation of power is the ability of Congress to make laws and the ability of the Supreme Court to say something is unconstitutional. So checks and balances are really what the branches can do over each other, while the separation of powers is what they are able to do within themselves. The last few things we're going to talk about, we have 2 slides left, are citizenship and ideology. And so this entire process, right, our whole history from the Articles of Confederation and the states' governments and Shays' Rebellion to the ratification of our Constitution and how it was written, established our three elements of citizenship that we still rely on today, which is number one, it's resting on the consent, right? Like we are consenting to being governed. Number two, there are no grades or levels of citizenship. You are a citizen or you are not. And if you are a citizen, it doesn't matter. You're a citizen. You have all of the rights, the unalienable rights as any other citizen, intentionally. And then the third one is that we're conferring equal rights on all citizens. So you're not a better citizen than someone else, and you don't have more rights the longer you're a citizen. Once you are a citizen, you have all the rights of being a citizen. It doesn't matter how long you've been a citizen or what you've done. Now, this has changed a little bit in current modern day. In a lot of states, felonies or felons who have committed felonies can't vote, right? So, like, their level of citizenship is a little bit lower than citizens who haven't committed felonies because now they can't participate in our basic level of government, which is voting. But in the 1700s, that was the idea, that there were no grades or levels and every citizen had equal rights. We also had this idea of like what an elite is and what an ordinary citizen is. So, competing elites. The elites were not united on their views of the government, right? We had anti-federalists and we had federalists. We had people who were wealthy and lawyers and owned enslaved peoples, and they wanted to be taxed and they wanted to not be able to vote if you didn't own land. But then we had elites who disagree with that. William Whiting, right? He said, no, we should tax and um, they should get paid regardless. So this idea of competing elites and their view of government kind of came to the surface during all of this conflict. But we also had the rise of ordinary citizen, which is the development of citizenship that really brought ordinary people into the politics and laid the foundation for individual rights. And this came from not only representation being based on population, but having like the House and eventually the Senate elected by the people, whereas other stuff, right, like the president really isn't, and Supreme Court isn't at all. So, in order to have a Congress, and in order to be a democratic Congress, the people had to participate. And it didn't matter, right, if you didn't own land or you weren't wealthy or you weren't a lawyer. You got to vote anyway. If you were a citizen, you got to vote. Again, this doesn't apply to everyone. Enslaved peoples couldn't vote, women couldn't vote, and a lot of non-wealthy people couldn't vote either, whether it was because of access to voting or what have you. But the idea being they still had a say in their government, and they were able to do this. That's all I have for this lecture. So again, I'm going to upload this, and then I will post an announcement on the Brightspace page with the link to our lecture, as well as the link to the pre-quiz, which is due Friday, and then the movie quiz, which is just a poll, and it has no due date. So it's just like, get it done, please, or I'm going to pick the movie for you. So, cool. Thank you so much.